No one in the audience could have imagined what was about to happen. The lights above the Family Feud stage glowed warm gold. Laughter drifted across the set, and Steve Harvey stood at his podium with that easy confidence that made millions feel at home. It was another taping day, another family, another game, or so everyone thought. But then came the moment that would change the air in the room. A little boy, no more than 8 years old, stepped up beside his mother. He held something tightly folded in his hands, a sheet of paper covered in colored pencil lines, edges slightly wrinkled from being held too long. Steve noticed it right away. He smiled, playful as always. "Hey, lil' man, what you got there?" The boy didn't answer right away. His eyes, big, honest, a little shy, darted to his mother. She gave a small nod. The boy's voice trembled, soft enough that only the front row could hear. "It's for you, Mr. Steve." Something shifted. The crowd hushed, sensing that this wasn't part of the game. The hum of cameras faded beneath the quiet rustle of paper as the boy walked forward. Steve bent down to meet him halfway, his expression gentle but curious. He took the drawing carefully, as if it were fragile. On the paper was a simple picture, a man in a suit standing on a stage beneath bright yellow lights, smiling beside a smaller figure holding his hand. Above them, written in careful, uneven letters, "Thank you for helping my dad laugh again." The studio seemed to freeze. The boy's mother covered her mouth, eyes glistening. The contestants looked at each other, unsure whether to smile or cry. Steve blinked, studying the picture, his cartoon likeness beside the tiny stick figure father. For a long second, he didn't speak. The laughter that had filled the room minutes earlier had vanished, replaced by something deeper, that sacred quiet that lives between love and loss. He looked up at the boy. "Son, what's this about?" The boy swallowed, his voice barely a whisper. "My dad was sick. He couldn't laugh no more. But he watched you every night." And then he started smiling again. You could feel the world hold its breath. The audience leaned forward. Even the camera operators forgot to move. Steve's hands trembled slightly as he traced the lines of the drawing. The colors weren't perfect. A child's hand never is, but somehow it captured everything. Joy, gratitude, hope. The boy continued, his words steady now. He said, "You made the hard days not so hard. And when he had to go to heaven, I wanted to tell you, thank you for making him happy." A sound broke from somewhere in the crowd, the kind that escapes before a person knows they're crying. Steve's throat tightened. For once, the man who always had something to say found no words at all. He just knelt down, at eye level with the boy, and whispered, "You did good, son. You did real good." The cameras caught it, the single tear sliding down Steve Harvey's cheek, glinting under the studio light. The audience rose to their feet, not in applause, but in reverence. In that moment, the stage wasn't a game show anymore. It was a place where grief met gratitude, where a child's love bridged the distance between worlds. Steve folded the drawing gently, pressing it against his chest. "I'll keep this safe," he said, voice breaking just enough for everyone to feel it. "Promise you that." And for a heartbeat, nothing else existed, not the cameras, not the countdown clock, not the bright screens. Only the echo of a little boy's courage and a host's quiet vow to remember. The taping had to stop. For once, production didn't matter. Not the timing, not the cue cards, not the laughter that usually filled every corner of the Family Feud studio. Steve Harvey stood motionless, the small drawing still clutched in his hand. The boy had returned to stand beside his mother, his small fingers curling into the hem of her blouse. His eyes darted towards Steve, unsure if he'd done something wrong. Steve caught that glance and immediately stepped forward, lowering himself again so he was face to face with the child. "Hey," he said softly. "You didn't do nothing wrong, lil' man. You just gave me something I ain't never been given before." The boy's mother wiped her eyes, trying to stay composed. Her name was Angela Turner, a nurse from Birmingham, Alabama. She had written to the show weeks earlier, explaining that her husband, Marcus, had been diagnosed with stage 4 lymphoma. He had spent the last months of his life watching Family Feud from a hospital bed, always insisting that laughter was still something worth fighting for. Angela hadn't told her son that their letter had been read by the producers. She hadn't told him that they'd invited her family to Atlanta for a special Family Heroes episode. She just wanted him to have one day that wasn't about hospitals or goodbyes. And now, watching her son stand under those bright studio lights, she knew he had turned their grief into something extraordinary. Steve rose slowly, his gaze sweeping across the studio. The audience was still quiet, hundreds of people who had come to laugh now sitting in a silence so thick it felt sacred. "Y'all," he began, his voice low and heavy with emotion. "You just never know what people are going through. You really don't." The crowd nodded, murmuring in agreement. He turned to Angela. "Ma'am, your husband. He sounds like a strong man." Angela nodded through her tears. "He was. He used to say, 'Even pain can't kill joy, not if you hold on to something good.' And you were that something good for him." Steve looked down again at the drawing, his hand trembling just slightly. "You telling me this man, this father, used to laugh with me every night?" "Yes," she said, her voice cracking. "You gave him something the doctors couldn't piece." Steve took a long breath, the kind that shakes on the way out. "Well," he whispered, "then he gave me something back today." You could feel it, that invisible exchange between strangers who understood the language of loss. The camera zoomed in slowly, capturing every small detail. Steve's wet eyes, the way his thumb brushed the folded paper, the quiet determination in Angela's expression as she tried not to fall apart. For the crew, it was impossible not to feel something. One camera operator later said, "It was like time stopped. Even the air felt different." Steve looked over at the audience, his voice carrying the weight of every story that had ever walked into his studio. "You know," he said softly, "we think this right here is a game show. We play, we laugh, we try to win some money. But sometimes, this stage becomes a place for God to remind us what really matters." A quiet amen came from somewhere in the crowd. The boy's name was Eli, and Steve crouched again beside him. "Eli," he said, "can I ask you something? What made you want to draw this picture?" Eli hesitated, his small hands fidgeting with his shirt. "My dad told me if I ever met you, I should give you a smile. So, I made one." Steve smiled faintly through the tears. "You sure did, son. You sure did." The studio audience wiped their eyes, strangers sharing tissues, mothers pulling children close. And somewhere behind the cameras, a producer turned away, wiping her own tears before signaling the crew to keep rolling. The lights seemed softer now, more golden than before, as if the room itself understood the sacredness of what had just happened. Angela took her son's hand. "We just wanted to thank you, Mr. Harvey, for showing us that joy doesn't die, even when someone we love does." Steve's expression shifted from heartbreak to gratitude. He held the drawing against his chest again, nodding slowly. "You're right," he whispered. "Joy don't die. It just changes who it lives in." The boy looked up, confused but comforted. Steve smiled. "You'll understand that one day." The audience erupted not in cheers, but in the kind of applause that feels like prayer. Steve stood still for a moment, letting it all wash over him, his eyes glancing upward as if searching for the man the drawing had been meant for. When he finally spoke again, his voice broke with quiet awe. "I've met a lot of people on this stage, but I don't think I've ever met courage this small, or love this big." And the lights above the Family Feud sign shimmered just a little brighter, like the world itself was trying to say thank you. When the cameras finally cut, no one moved. The applause had faded, but the emotion lingered in the air like a soft echo, the kind that refuses to leave even after the sound has stopped. Steve Harvey walked off the stage quietly, still holding the folded drawing in his hand. He didn't joke, didn't smile for the crew, didn't say the usual, "Good show, y'all." He just stood there behind the curtain, staring at that paper as if it held the whole weight of the world. In the green room, the Turner family sat together, Angela, with one arm around Eli, whispering something only he could hear. Steve appeared in the doorway a few moments later, not as the host, not as a celebrity, but as a man whose heart had just been broken open in the best way. "Hey, y'all mind if I sit a minute?" he asked softly. Angela nodded. Of course. He lowered himself onto the couch beside Eli, his tall frame folding gently, as if not to disturb the air around them. For a moment, none of them spoke. The silence felt right tender, unforced, like the kind of stillness people only share when they understand each other without needing words. Finally, Steve turned to Angela. "Tell me about him, your husband." Her eyes softened. "Marcus was steady," she said, smiling through the sadness. "He was the kind of man who fixed everything, not just things that broke, but people too. He was funny, always finding a way to make us laugh, even on the bad days. But when he got sick," her voice trailed off. "He couldn't find his laugh anymore." Eli shifted closer to his mom. "Until he watched you," he whispered. Steve swallowed hard. "He said that?" Eli nodded. "He said you make the world lighter." Steve looked down at the drawing again, at the stick figures holding hands beneath that bright yellow sun. He smiled faintly. "Your daddy's got good taste." Angela laughed softly through her tears. He really did. They sat together in that small room. 3 people from different worlds, a famous host, a grieving mother, and a little boy with crayons and courage bound together by a memory of laughter that refused to die. Steve leaned back and sighed. "You know, I've been doing this a long time. I've seen folks cry, seen folks win, seen 'em lose. But today," he shook his head, "today reminded me why God let me do this job. It ain't for the jokes, or the money, or the ratings. It's for this. For people like y'all." Angela smiled gently. "Maybe that's why Marcus loved watching you so much. You didn't just make him laugh, you reminded him that joy was still possible." Steve's voice grew quieter. "You ever feel like somebody up there is sending you a little reminder?" Angela blinked back her tears. "Every day." Steve nodded slowly, glancing down at Eli. "I think today was one of those days." Eli tilted his head. "You mean like a sign?" Steve smiled. "Yeah, lil' man, like a sign that your daddy's still got work to do through you, through your mama, maybe even through me." Angela reached out, touching Steve's hand. He'd like that. Outside, the faint sound of the next taping filtered through the hallway. Laughter, clapping, the rhythm of a new family taking their turn at joy. But inside the green room, the world was quiet and sacred. Steve took a breath, his voice trembling with something like prayer. "You know, when I get up there one day," he said, looking at the ceiling, "I'm gonna tell your daddy thank you for reminding me why laughter matters." Eli smiled. "He'll probably make you laugh too." Steve chuckled, the first true laugh since the moment began. "I bet he will." They sat there for another long while, sharing stories about Marcus, his favorite songs, the way he burned toast every Sunday morning, how he called Angela sunshine, even when she was mad. Every memory was a thread, weaving something back together that grief had tried to tear apart. When it was finally time for them to leave, Steve stood and shook Angela's hand firmly, then knelt again beside Eli. "You keep drawing, you hear me? 'Cause the world needs people who make it brighter." "I will," Eli said with a shy grin. Steve touched the boy's shoulder. "And thank you for reminding me that sometimes the smallest gifts hold the biggest truth." He walked them to the hallway, watching as Angela and Eli disappeared down the corridor. When the door finally closed behind them, Steve stayed there alone, quiet, still holding the drawing close to his chest. Later that evening, in his dressing room, he pinned the picture to the mirror. The bright yellow sun reflected off the glass, catching the edge of his eyes. He whispered to the empty room, "Marcus, I see you, man. I see you." And maybe it was just the light playing tricks, or maybe it was something else entirely, but for a second, Steve could have sworn the reflection smiled back. The next morning, Steve arrived at the studio earlier than usual. The crew hadn't even finished setting up the lights when he walked in, holding a cup of coffee in one hand and that same folded drawing in the other. He moved slowly across the empty stage, looking around as if seeing it differently now, not as a set for a game show, but as a place where people's hearts had quietly opened the night before. He unfolded the paper again, smoothing out its creases, and placed it gently on the podium where he usually rested his cue cards. The childlike lines glowed softly under the studio lights. Himself, smiling beside a father and son, all beneath that golden sun. For a moment, the cameras, the screens, the laughter, none of it existed. Only that image, he whispered, almost to himself. This is what it's really about. When the first crew members spotted him, they paused, unsure if they should interrupt. It wasn't every day they saw Steve that still, that quiet. Finally, his longtime stage manager, Curtis, approached. "Morning, boss," he said carefully. "You all right?" Steve nodded slowly. "Yeah, man. Just thinking about yesterday." Curtis smiled knowingly. "That family, yeah, they got to all of us." Steve exhaled. "You ever feel like somebody walks into your life for 10 minutes, but they leave something that stays forever?" Curtis nodded. "Happens more than we notice, I think." Steve smiled faintly. "Yeah. Well, that little boy left me something I ain't ever forgettin'." A pause hung between them before Steve looked back down at the podium. "Let's make sure we do every show like this one might be somebody's last laugh, you hear me?" Curtis's eyes softened. "You got it." The morning taping began as usual, audience laughter, bright lights, the familiar hum of the theme music. But those who had been there the day before could feel something different. The energy was softer, deeper. Even Steve's tone had changed. His jokes still landed, his charisma still filled the room, but underneath every laugh there was something quieter, a pulse of gratitude, an awareness of the unseen. Between takes, Steve kept glancing toward the drawing. At one point, a contestant noticed it taped beside his cue cards and asked, "What's that, Steve? Your fan art?" He smiled. "Yeah," he said softly. "You could say that." The audience laughed, not knowing the truth, and the show went on. But every time Steve looked at that drawing, he remembered Eli's voice. He said, "You make the world lighter." After the final round wrapped, Steve returned to his dressing room. He sat down in front of the mirror, the weight of the day pressing gently against him. He thought about Marcus, a man he'd never met, yet who somehow felt like an old friend now. He imagined him watching from somewhere beyond the lights, proud of his wife, his son, and perhaps even of the man who had unknowingly helped him through his hardest days. Steve picked up his pen and reached for a note card. In slow, deliberate handwriting, he began to write, "To Angela and Eli, thank you for reminding me that what we do here matters more than we know. Your strength and love reminded us all that laughter is holy and kindness lasts longer than pain. I'll never forget Marcus's smile, the one you gave back to him. With love and gratitude, Steve Harvey." He sealed the envelope and handed it to the production office, asking them to send it to Birmingham. That evening, as the sun dipped low over Atlanta, Steve drove home with the windows down. The air felt different, lighter, somehow. Traffic moved slowly, but he didn't mind. The world outside seemed softer, like it was breathing in sync with him. When he got home, he walked straight to his study and placed the drawing in a small wooden frame. It sat beside a photo of his family, a reminder that even in the most ordinary moments, something extraordinary could happen. Later that night, during dinner, his wife asked, "You've been quiet today. Long shoot?" He smiled faintly, shaking his head. "Nah, just a powerful one." She looked up from her plate, curious. "Something happen?" He hesitated, then said softly, "Yeah. A little boy showed me what love looks like in crayon." She smiled, not needing any more explanation. Before bed, Steve walked through his hallway, where photos of his career hung, decades of laughter, moments with families, stage lights frozen in time. But now, as he passed them, one thought returned again and again. Every smile on that stage belonged to someone fighting a battle he couldn't see. He stopped at the last photo, him laughing on set, and whispered, "Thank you, Marcus." In another part of the country, Angela and Eli received his letter. They opened it together at the kitchen table, their small home bathed in afternoon light. When Angela finished reading, she pressed the note against her heart and whispered, "He remembered." Eli smiled. "Told you he would." Angela looked at her son and said quietly, "Your dad would have loved that." Eli nodded. I think he saw it already. The room fell into peaceful silence, the kind of silence that doesn't hurt anymore. And far away, in a studio lit by gold and memory, Steve Harvey looked at the framed drawing one more time and whispered, "Rest easy, brother. We'll keep the laughter going." The stage light flickered softly, like a small heartbeat of gratitude echoing through time. Weeks passed, but the moment never left him. Every time Steve Harvey walked onto the Family Feud stage, he would glance toward that drawing framed now, sitting quietly on the corner of his dressing room mirror. It had become more than a keepsake. It was a compass, a reminder that somewhere beyond the laughter, beyond the applause, there were people holding on to hope with both hands. The show went on, episode after episode. Families laughed, cheered, teased one another, and Steve kept doing what he did best, making people forget their pain for a little while. But something inside him had shifted. The jokes felt deeper now. The smiles meant more. The laughter carried weight, not the kind that crushes, but the kind that holds. One evening, during a break between tapings, Steve sat backstage with his producers. They were reviewing the week's schedule when he suddenly stopped, eyes lingering on the studio lights overhead. "You ever think," he said softly, "about how many people in that audience came here to laugh, because they needed to?" His producer, Dana, looked up. "You mean like, as therapy?" Steve nodded. "Yeah. Like maybe some of them ain't just watching a game show, maybe they're trying to remember how to smile again." Dana smiled faintly. "That's the whole point, isn't it?" Steve leaned back, his voice quieter now. "It is, but that boy, Eli, he reminded me that laughter don't just fill the silence. Sometimes it heals what words can't reach." There was a long pause, the kind of pause that makes everyone in the room start thinking about their own lives, the people they've lost, the things they've survived, the small mercies that pulled them through. After the break, when Steve returned to the stage, he carried that truth with him. You could feel it in the way he looked at contestants, how he listened more closely, how his laughter came not from habit but from the heart. The audience noticed it too. Weeks later, a family from Michigan came to play. During introductions, one of the contestants, a grandmother with bright eyes and silver hair, smiled and said, "Steve, my husband watched you every day when he was going through chemo. You made him laugh even when he couldn't talk no more." The room went still. Steve looked at her for a long second before smiling gently. "He sounded like a good man," he said. "He was," she replied softly. "And now it's my turn to play for him." Steve nodded slowly, his eyes glistening under the studio lights. "Well then," he said, voice trembling just a little, "let's make him proud today." That day's episode went viral too, not because of a funny moment or a wild reaction, but because of the way the host paused before every round, letting each word land like a prayer. People online wrote, "It's like Steve's carrying all our stories now." And in a way, he was. At home, every evening, Steve would sit at his desk and open the letters fans sent to the studio, messages from people across the world who had seen the episode with Eli and his mother. A veteran wrote to say that he had started watching again after years of depression. A single mother wrote that the story helped her talk to her kids about their father's passing. A teenage boy wrote, "I lost my mom last year, but now I draw her smiles too." Each letter was a thread, and together, they were weaving something beautiful. One night, Steve gathered all those letters and laid them out on his table, hundreds of them, covering the wood in a patchwork of paper and ink. In the center, he placed Eli's drawing. Then he whispered, "Marcus, look at what your boy started." It was late, but he stayed there for hours, reading line after line until his eyes blurred. Every word carried the same message. "Thank you for reminding us that kindness still matters." He thought about his own childhood, about the struggles he'd faced, the people who had believed in him when he had nothing. And he realized something, all of it. Every bit of pain and triumph had led him here, to this stage, to this moment, to this purpose. The next day, he arrived at the studio with a new idea. He called a meeting with the producers and said, "I want to start a segment not about games, not about winning money, but about people. about real folks with stories like Eli's family. We'll call it Moments That Matter. The team exchanged glances. One of them asked, "You mean like, feature them on the show?" Steve nodded. "Yeah, give 'em a space. Let 'em tell the world what love looks like when life gets hard." And that's how it began. One story, one drawing, one act of courage from a child who just wanted to say, "Thank you." Months later, Steve invited Angela and Eli back to the studio, this time not to play, but to be guests on Moments That Matter. When they walked in, Steve greeted them with the same warmth, the same soft smile, but something new glimmered in his eyes: reverence. He pointed toward the audience screen, and there it was, Eli's drawing, enlarged and glowing behind them, framed by the Family Feud lights. Steve turned to the crowd. "This right here," he said, his voice steady, "is why I do what I do." The room erupted in applause. Eli smiled, his little hands gripping his mother's tightly, as if holding the weight of every heart their story had touched. Steve looked at them, his tone quiet but resolute. "Your daddy's still laughing, son. He's just doing it from a better seat now." And as the audience rose in a standing ovation, Angela closed her eyes and whispered through her tears, "He sure is." The applause that followed was like a wave, not loud, not wild, but soft, steady, reverent. It wasn't celebration, it was recognition. People weren't just clapping for a TV moment. They were clapping for love that refused to fade, for a family that had turned grief into gratitude, and for a host who had reminded them all that laughter is sometimes a language of survival. Steve Harvey stood quietly on the stage as the lights dimmed, his hands resting on the podium. The giant screen behind him still showed Eli's drawing, two figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun, surrounded by the words, "Thank you for helping my dad laugh again." He turned to the audience and smiled, the kind of smile that carries both heartbreak and hope. "You know," he began softly, "we spend so much of our lives chasing things, money, success, fame, but what that little boy showed me is that the only thing that really matters is how you make people feel." The room was silent, hundreds of faces listening as if the world outside no longer existed. Steve continued, his voice trembling with sincerity. "I've been blessed to stand on this stage for a long time. I've seen families win cars. I've seen them lose by 1 point. I've seen a lot of laughter. But what happened here, what Eli did, reminded me that joy ain't a prize. It's a purpose." The camera slowly zoomed in, capturing every crease of emotion in his expression. "Somewhere out there tonight, somebody's sitting in a hospital room, or at a kitchen table, or driving home from work, thinking the light's gone out of their life. But I want you to remember something. Sometimes, that light don't disappear. It just moves into somebody else." He looked back toward Eli and Angela, who were sitting side by side in the front row. "That little boy didn't just bring me a drawing. He brought me a lesson, one that I'll carry for the rest of my days." He paused, then added quietly, "And I know his daddy's up there smiling, saying, 'That's my boy.'" The crowd stood, many wiping their eyes. Some hugged each other. Others simply closed their eyes and let the moment sink in. Later that night, after the show ended, Steve walked through the empty studio alone. The lights were off now, and the set, normally bright and alive, felt almost like a church. He walked to the podium, where he'd placed the framed drawing again, and just stood there. He ran his fingers along the edge of the glass. "You did something, Marcus," he whispered. "You turned your son into a messenger." For a while, he didn't move. The silence wasn't heavy, it was peaceful, filled with quiet gratitude. He thought about all the faces that had crossed his stage over the years, all the stories he would never fully know, all the hearts that had found healing in unexpected moments. He finally took a seat in the front row, the same seat where Eli had sat hours before, and looked up at the big Family Feud sign hanging above the stage. "It's funny," he murmured, half to himself. "You spend your life telling jokes. Then one day, a kid shows up and tells you the truth." The cleaning crew worked quietly around him, careful not to disturb the stillness. When Steve finally rose to leave, he glanced one last time at the framed picture and smiled. "Rest easy, brother," he said softly. "Your family's still laughin'." Outside, the Atlanta night was cool and clear. He looked up at the sky, a deep navy scattered with faint stars, and for a brief moment, he imagined Marcus looking back, that same gentle grin on his face. He whispered, "We did good today." Back in Birmingham, Angela tucked Eli into bed. He clutched a small Family Feud keychain Steve had given him, turning it over in his tiny hands. "Mom," he asked, "do you think Dad saw the show?" Angela brushed his hair back from his forehead, smiling through her tears. "I think he didn't miss a second." Eli smiled sleepily. "Then he's laughing again." "He sure is," she whispered, "and so are we." As she turned off the lamp, the last light in the room came from the small drawing hanging on Eli's wall, the same one Steve now kept framed in his dressing room. Two suns, glowing in two different places, both born from the same little boy's love. And far away, in a world lit by stage lights and faith, Steve Harvey stepped into his car, started the engine, and whispered one last time before driving off. "Sometimes, television doesn't just entertain, it heals." If this story touched your heart, don't just leave quietly, tell us in the comments below. What part of this story stayed with you the most? Was it a word, a moment, or something it reminded you of in your own life? We read every single message because your stories keep this space alive. And if you believe the world still needs moments like this, hit subscribe, join our family, and help us keep remembering the stories that deserve to be told. This is Stories Left Behind, where human stories are never lost, and where your story might be the next one we tell.